Hi, combat feel. Have you ever played a game?
Yes.
Have you ever played a game where the combat just feels flat? But then there are other games that just have that visceral feel. There are a lot of things that go into that: animation, sound design, visual effects. But I'm an indie developer. I don't have time for that. That's why you shouldn't try to be like those games. You don't need to be a professional animator, sound designer, or VFX artist to have good combat feel. And in this video, I'll show you how to achieve good combat feel as an indie game developer. Let's start off by looking at Valheim, an indie game made by a small team with an old school graphic style, but it feels great to play. Why? Let's break down a basic hit. Step 1, anticipation. This is where the player winds up the hit. This gives a lot of the weightiness of the attack. The importance of this really depends on the type of game you're making. If you want very slow, deliberate, weighty combat, you'll want long anticipation with a focus on good animation. But if you want more fast-paced action combat, the anticipation can be as simple as a single pose for 1/10 of a second. And in this clip, there's also a simple smear particle effect, giving a sense of motion. Step 2, hit. This is where most of that visceral feel comes in, with lots of techniques in a very short time span. Let's break down every effect in this clip's hit, starting with animation. The enemy plays a stagger animation and gets knocked back very quickly. In just one frame, it goes from this to this, and the whole thing is only 1/10 of a second. This is an important number because to the human brain, 1/10 of a second feels smooth but instant. That's why hit animation 1/10 of a second. Next up, freeze frame. For a single frame, or about 20 milliseconds, right after the attack hits, absolutely nothing changes. This is called a freeze frame, and it's a classic trick dating all the way back to Street Fighter. You can even freeze for several frames for a very powerful attack. Next effect. This one is polarizing, but very effective. Screen shake. Valheim uses it heavily. When something hits, the screen shakes. This is the lowest effort, highest reward way to make something feel impactful. But also, a lot of people really don't like it, and will just turn it off immediately. So just keep that in mind. Next up, particles. In Valheim, it's an explosion of clouds and sparkles, but also the player is leveling up their axis skill, which means more sparkles, and also this glowing circle. VFX is an excellent way to add visceral feel to combat, but also it's hard to get right. It's easy to go overboard, and a big red flag of bad combat feel is tons of super high fidelity models in VFX, but otherwise very flat combat. In my opinion, unless you're very experienced with VFX, it's best to just keep it simple, like Valheim does, keeping the style consistent and readable. Next up, sound. Forget everything I just said about VFX, because for sound, the better the better. A game with high quality sound and low quality everything else still feels pretty good. And if there's anywhere you should invest in high quality assets, it's probably sound. Listen to this. Then finally, the third part of an attack, follow-through/recovery. This is usually the longest part of an attack, and like the anticipation, also gives a sense of weight to the attack. With slow, deliberate combat, having several seconds of recovery, to fast-paced action games, having just a few tenths of a second, often with animation canceling, making it even faster. And in the case of this Valheim clip, the focus is on the player animation, following through with the attack, also the enemy regaining its balance, and many of the hit effects like screen shake, particles, and sound following through and fading out. Okay, so we analyzed the combat in Valheim, but do these concepts really work in practice? To test this, I'm going to build a very, very low fidelity prototype and see if I can inject it with good combat feel. So here's my prototype. Rectangular walls and a floor with stretched out stable diffusion PS1 textures, vertex lighting, and no shadows. Also, the default RuneScape character model with a sword that's just a white rectangle, and a goblin model generated with Shapey. So here's how it looks with just the animation and freeze frame. Now, let's add some very traditional, classic WoW style combat text. Next up, sound. I use these very crunchy, glitchy sounds to match the style I'm going for. Next effect, an effect that wasn't in Valheim, but is a very simple way to add tons of impact, and that's a white flash. Just render the enemy solid white really fast for like 2 or 3 frames. That's already a lot better. Next, particles. I'm just doing an explosion of sparks from the sword. Next up, knockback. It's a very simple way to make the attack feel heavier. And next, glitchy post-processing. And finally, the very impactful but polarizing screen shake. Now that's impactful. Let's recap. With our collection of simple, low-fidelity effects, we went from this to this. Future Kex here. I kept working on this prototype for a couple weeks, and now it looks like this, where you can chain together combos to earn combo points. The idea is kind of like Devil May Cry RuneScape. You can try it yourself, free on itch.io, and maybe someday I'll make it into a full game. So anyway, back to the past. You may not want to use all these effects. In fact, there are some combat-focused indie games, especially with more slow, deliberate combat, that have almost none of these, focusing almost entirely on weighty animations and satisfying sound. But they're still fun to play. But if you're sitting there wondering, why does my combat feel like a wet paper bag? How do I fix it in the easiest way possible? Then I hope this video helped you. Thank you for watching. Wishlist or set on Steam.